Have you ever wondered why you've fallen in love with this person? Or perhaps you're wondering, why have you become limerent on this person? Maybe you can't even tell the difference. Interestingly, when you're in love and when you're in limerent love, there is this sense of being fully consumed by thoughts of this person, and this person may appear all too perfect. There isn't a single reason why this person has become the center of your obsession, but there are several contributing factors which we are going to look at from Dorothy Tennov's original research in the late 70s. We are going to look at that and compare it to object relations theorist Ronald Fairbairn. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the bell to get notified on all things limerence. I'm also going to do a little bit of a series here where questions that you guys ask or comments that you make, I'm going to talk about. The question that we're actually talking about comes from one of the subscribers about making a distinction between falling in love and what it is that makes us attracted to this particular person. Just as a disclaimer, this isn't medical advice, and everything that I'm talking about are some of my lived experiences, some of my observations, and research that I've just put together. Let's start from the beginning with talking about Tennov's original research. She didn't explicitly assign any particular psychodynamic or psychoanalytic framework such as object relations theory. But over time, what we start to see is that there are some connections between her observations of the phenomenon and attachment theory and object relations theory, which gives us a deeper look at the more unconscious aspects and motivations to why people become limerent over a particular person. Instead, what she did in her original research was compile patterns of behavior and emotional experiences associated with people that she interviewed. So here's a brief list of some of the things. We're not going to go over each of the things on this list, but I want to point out some specific ones that I think really point to why this person and why limerence instead of romantic love. She aimed to create a scientific inquiry on romantic love and blend it in with a philosophy of the state of love that inspires. She didn't want to conform to Freud and limit it to just the biological drives. She aimed to transcend this pleasure-seeking principle. And the reason that we are talking about Ronald Fairbairn and his view on object relations theory is because he had very much the same divergence. Fairbairn was overshadowed by Freud's more authoritarian theories on psychosexual development and its impact on later desires in romantic relationships. Fairbairn and many object relations theorists attempted to move away from that. A driving force was pleasure. They wanted to demonstrate how the infant actually experienced a desire to move towards the object of affection, or the object, the person, the caregiver, for emotional connection. Tennov initially said that there had to be a sexual interest, but later that was changed. She said that if somebody wanted sex from the limerent object, it was actually only if it represented reciprocation. What is ultimately important for somebody who is limerently in love or limerently attached is to feel as though this person is reciprocating emotional connection. So if the sex symbolized reciprocation, then it was on the table. But otherwise, it didn't really matter. Okay, let's back up here for a moment just in case you didn't catch that, because we're going to be looking at some models that differentiated from Freud's ideas of libidinal development. Libidinal development, to Fairbairn, was emotional rather than sexual. A healthy libidinal development meant that the child forms secure attachment, balanced relationships. But if they didn't, it would cause disruptions later in life with their sense of self and their way that they relate in relationships. So forming these attachments early in childhood was a reflection of the ways that they would form attachments in their adult lives. Why are we talking about libidinal development? I think that people who are prone to limerence and the people that become limerent objects to the limerent sufferer is actually somebody who reflects that longing that they have within them. And we're going to look at this specifically from the different theories that is presented by Fairbairn's perspective on object relations, which is through the transitional states and the neurosis that is derived from those, specifically the hysterical technique. And then the most important of all that I believe to be a part of this particular limerent attachment is the schizoid factor and how it relates to this emotional detachment, but this intense longing and fantasy that people who experience limerence describe. And before we go any further, I know that this is a lot of psychobabble, so I included some of the links in the description if you want to do some of your own research and synthesize some of this information. Please definitely do add to this discourse. Tell me what you think some of the contributing factors are that make people fall in love with this particular person and just fall in love in general. And I mean limerent love, not romantic love. I'm going to talk about those distinctions. I'm going to give you guys some more background on the origin of this particular concept. Tennov never really wanted to boil this experience of love down into just a psychopathology. In fact, she didn't seem to say that there was any correlation or consistent findings of any well-known mental illness with those limerent sufferers. What I found interesting was that when she interviewed some of these people who had experienced limerence, there was no discrimination with gender, age, orientation, but she did find it afflicted the creative type, maybe disproportionately the creative type, not just because limerence is sort of like a creative process in which it is involuntary and subconscious, but I think from other research, we know that anxious attachment, which it seems like a lot of limerent people have, is very much correlated with the personality trait of neuroticism. Later on, there are other research that come out that show that people who have obsessive compulsive tendencies are more prone to limerence, but that's for another time. Again, she was very careful not to pathologize it to the extent that it was considered an addiction. And for me, I call it a person addiction because the neurochemicals in romantic love is very similar to that of any behavioral addiction or process addiction. That there is this hit of dopamine and the reward system and this pain and pleasure aspect to limerence. She made that distinction again that it wasn't an addiction and it was more so an altered state of mind, meaning that it was more of a style of attachment that affected your mood, your cognition, and your perceptions. While most people are familiar with attachment theory, which is the splitting of secure and insecure parent and how responsive your parent was in infancy, people aren't as familiar with object relations theory, but I like to use that as the foundation for understanding limerence because it talks about more of the internal representation of the object or of the romantic partner, rather just the surface of how they are interacting with one another. Because a lot of limerence is what happens on the inside of somebody's fantasies and of their longings. So object relations theory diverge into the limerent fantasies, which if you want to learn more about, check out this other video. We are going to dive more into the 3 ways that I think limerence happens for these folks and why these folks in particular are the ones that become limerent objects. Let's start with reciprocity and uncertainty. It's kind of like the bread and butter of limerence. There really wouldn't be limerence if there wasn't these barriers and obstacles, which sounds really cruel, but it's just the reality that limerence is this really one-sided, unrequited love. I do want to explore in another video probably about mutual limerence, which I'm not sure exists, but maybe some of you guys can tell me more about that so that we can have a dialogue about it. But for now, we are going to look at classical cases of limerence where it is unrequited and one-sided. This one-sidedness creates this intense longing, right? Because when you're in that limerent state, when you're in that limerent attachment, you start to wonder, does this person feel the same way about me? And now that's the same with any romantic love. There's always this sense of wanting to know if the person that you want and crave and desire feels the same about you. What's different about limerence and romantic love is that it always lives on this edge of reciprocation. That if there weren't obstacles, we wouldn't develop the level of intensity and of obsession. And in fact, it happens against your will. Tennov described it to be almost like there was this ratio between hope and doubt, which creates this perfect storm, which creates this love story. This is why people in limerence believe to see signs that the other person is reciprocating, and their mood can very much change depending on whether or not this person responds the way they want. When we think about object relations theory, we are talking about projecting a very particular yearning onto someone else, onto this limerent object. And as Tennov would put it, for the process to fully develop, some form of uncertainty or doubt, or even some threat to reciprocation appears necessary. There is considerable evidence that an externally imposed obstacle, such as Romeo and Juliet, met in the resistance of family and society may also serve. In that, she's also talking about external obstacles and plausible reciprocation. And it ties in closely with Fairbairn's schizoid defenses. I think an easy way to understand schizoid defenses is to think of internal preoccupation and external detachment. So on the inside, this person is longing and yearning to be connected to the other, but on the outside, they might appear distant. One of Fairbairn's greatest contribution was schizoid factor because it started to talk about borderline states or splitting states, which in order to understand how this happens, we have to understand what it means in our early stages of infancy. Let's look at this particular model. I also included these models in the link if you want to check it out. His theory was that our fundamental motivation early in life was to relate to others. And this is what would develop the self through this libidinal connection. This is how we would develop our sense of self and the way that we later relate to people in adulthood. The original ego is the baby, and the baby and all of us are born as our full self. And we're connecting to the parent and wanting to feel loved and to have our needs met by them by feeling as though we are accepted and loved. When the baby doesn't feel this sense of acceptance and love, which is what we call the primary trauma, which is actually universal because there's no way that we can feel this unending certainty of being loved, and to some degree our parents and those we are dependent on will disappoint us. The baby can't deal with these early abandonments. So what happens here when the parent is not able to provide this love, this libidinal connection, this original ego and the whole self has to find a way to manage the pain that comes with that. So what they do is they take a retreat from dangers in relationships. So this is how the schizoid position develops. Now we're looking at the second model where the split has taken place. And again, this is the parent or caregiver. And this is now considered the central ego. instead of the whole self or the original ego. The self has changed and it has become more so ambivalence of their relationship to the parent through this manageable inner relationship. So who is this ideal object? This ideal object is the ideal parent. It relates to this ideal parent as a way to maintain their sanity from having had this bad experience. They've internalized aspects that feel more tolerable. I'll talk about the third model when we talk about repression of this. We're going to focus more on this side. We are going to talk about how when this process is repressed, what starts to happen, and you see this arrow going upwards, is that, and when I say repress, I mean like they are trying to block out this feeling of wanting, of connecting. So they become this libidinal ego. They fragmented themselves, the baby, and this is now their accepted self. The accepted self is repressed, which is the part of them that they feel is too needy. So this needy self is repressed, and what happens on the surface, or how it's consciously experienced, is that it becomes intense dependency cravings. That's what this object is. It is the inner relationship that excites them beyond what they can endure. This is the parent. This is the idealized image of the parent. Exciting object. So now it's come to this place of really relating more vividly to an inner projection of the other. Instead of them experiencing this other person as they are, as we know in Limerence, schizoid feature would only allow you to project onto this person what is positive and not necessarily what is negative. And we're going to talk more about this when we go into talking about crystallization. But the main thing is that in schizoid features, there is this inner division of wanting the other person, but being in so denial of those emotions that you withdraw if they respond because of this fear of the bad object, which is essentially this idea that this person could hurt you, that relationships in the past, in early infancy, has hurt you, and so you retreat to this particular fantasy. I guess before we go any further, I want to make some distinctions about schizoid features. Because when people hear schizoid, they might think of schizophrenia, they might think of schizoid personality disorder and such. But when I talk about schizoid features, I'm talking more about the personality structure and how somebody relates to another being. It isn't so much the psychotic or clinically diagnosable schizoid personality disorder, which looks like flat affect, very withdrawn. We're talking more about this like avoidant attachment and this preoccupation with this internal fantasy and longing. And I think that people who are in limerence and who are drawn to particular people fall into this almost dissociative fantasy and longing state the schizoid feature presents. Now, there's also other types of personality features, such as like narcissism or borderline states, that could represent this form of attachment where there is an idealization. But I thought what was interesting with schizoid feature was the different techniques that we're going to talk about in this video later. When you're in limerence, the mind goes from, this person is perfect, they love me, how can I get proof? And repeat. The second part to this is the familiarity and emotional resonance. Most people who fall in love describe feeling like this person is familiar, almost like a soulmate, or that there's this sense of coming home. What is this about? I think I want to share a little bit about Imago theory. It comes from object relations theory, and it's similar to object relations theory. Only difference is that there is a more conscious way of using these projections. Imago means image in Latin. In therapy, you work on a conscious level to utilize this unconscious image of the familiar love. So in Imago theory, they believe that when you choose a partner, it's always unconscious, that there's some sort of mental blueprint and emotional response that you have when you meet the other who you have chemistry with, because they have qualities that are both good qualities and bad qualities from your parents. In Imago Therapy, they very much believe this is why this person fits the puzzle of creating a conscious relationship, because they do have the qualities that can create an emotionally corrective experience that can be quite healing if both people are willing to recognize that they very much love each other for all the things that they also dislike about each other. We know that there is the good object, which represents the loving, nurturing, and attentive side of our parent and or caregiver. And then there's the bad object, which represents the caregivers that are neglectful, rejecting, or emotionally unavailable. So we internalize both good and bad, and that's how we essentially choose our partners. I mean, this is just one theory. There's a lot. There's Helen Fisher's theory on the evolutionary aspects to it, and this is just one. The link is in the bio if you want to learn more about Imago theory. But now what happens and what is different from romantic love and with limerence is that there is this involuntary, obsessive, and intrusive way of attaching to this person that remains stuck in that space. Familiar being who you want them to be, who you long for them to be, and what is reflected narcissistically. And what is similar here in this familiarity and emotional resonance is that there is a long-standing projection, much like the schizoid feature. This person projects onto the external object almost chronically. So this fantasy that you want this loving parent who makes you feel understood, that makes you suddenly see with new eyes, is just a projection of attachment injuries. Now, this emotional resonance or love or attachments to this LO is often, interestingly, from afar and secretive, much like a person who has schizoid features, where they feel as though relationships, rejection, and all those bad things externally are too scary to approach. So they retreat into just holding onto, unconsciously and consciously, to the aspects of the LO that feels more tolerable. Let me directly answer the question with this last point on idealization. When we're talking about romantic love, we're talking about looking at the lover with rose-colored glasses, in a process Tennov would call crystallization. She actually borrowed this from French writer Stendhal in his 1821 treatise on love, de l'amour. The term crystallization was inspired by Stendhal's journey to the salt mines near Salzburg, where he witnessed salt crystallization and how it illuminated and grew almost overnight on the branches of the trees and made them even more beautiful. Much like romantic love, which almost happens overnight, it feels as though we see only the attractive qualities of the lover, object of shimmering beauty. What she found really interesting was how crystallization fashions an image of perfections from the LO's actual attractive features, the process being one of emphasis rather than complete invention. It was fascinating for her to realize that many of these people had an ability to really point out the very good qualities about these LOs. They were not hallucinations. These were things that are so minute, but like these crystals growing on this twig, these limerence sufferers were so able to overlook some of the negative qualities of the person. It was said that he drew this picture of how love unfolds in 4 stages on the back of a playing card. He described it to be from Bologna to Rome, and that by the time he was in Rome, he was in love. It starts with admiration, marveling at the qualities of the loved one, an acknowledgement where you start to recognize how lovely it feels. You like seeing them, touching them, sensing them, and being as close to this lover as much as possible. And then there's the hope, where you envision what it would be like to win the love of that person. And then there's delight. One exaggerates the beauty of the other person. We see this person as maybe all good, and at times we don't see their other flaws. That's very common in romantic love. But imagine that in Limerence, instead of going through these 4 stages that were outlined in this process of falling in love, you are stuck wanting the reciprocation and seeing them as this all haloed perfect being. And when they don't fit that, well, those are the later stages of Limerence. These misperceptions or positive illusions seem to be more of distortions in mental activity. These weren't invented positive attributes. These were truly positive about them. But the fact that these people were able to really point them out and hone in on that was almost like a superpower, very blinding. This process of crystallization and this state of being suspended in crystallization reminded me of the idealization of the good object and the fear of the bad object. Fairbairn had very similar findings when it came to some folks who were suspended in this state of infantile dependence. They were methods of struggling through moving from infantile to mature dependence. Essentially, seeing the other, the object, as separate from yourself. Neurosis is born from trying to move from this infantile stage. There were 4 different neuroses. There was paranoid, phobic, obsessional, and or hysterical technique. Now, I'm not going to talk about all 4 of them, and I put the link in the description. So if anyone wants to maybe share any other ways that they see comparisons between these different techniques and that of Limerence, please be my guest. I would love to hear your thoughts. It almost seems as though people who experience Limerence don't see them as separate from themselves. It's very disorienting, and much like the hysterical technique, this is where this takes place. When we have Limerence, this exciting object is what we're relating to now. And we are preoccupied with this need for emotional connection, which afflicts us because we are trying to maintain our fantasy of this person and put them on a pedestal to which they could never fulfill. This search for validation that comes from this exciting object is very one-sided, and it's very displaced in this emotional suffering of choosing unavailable partners. When you're using this hysterical technique, there is a search for validation and a response from the other that distorts your perception of the relationship. The hysterical technique distorts relationships with real people. Tennov would suggest that one move out of Limerence, and there's 3, I believe, ways that she talks about it. But in Fairbairn's notion of healthy libidinal development, the person has to develop mature dependence, which is, again, to see the other person as separate from themselves and to not resort to immature defenses like splitting or regressive reenactments. So you might notice that I have a different background. It is a different day, and the truth is I shot a different version of my closing thoughts. I didn't feel like it fit with the heart of the research. I wanted it to be grounded and more applicable to our day-to-day and your lived experience of Limerence. And I've put it that love was a human religion, and Limerence, in a sense, was the person they believed in. And adding a scientific inquiry into romantic love and trying to understand and pinpoint what it is and how it works doesn't necessarily take away from the beauty of it. Tennov really did a fine job of having empathy around this topic. Same with Fairbairn. They both wanted to humanize the field of psychology in subtle ways. Fairbairn had his patients sit side by side him or even slightly facing him in a chair, which was so different than other psychoanalysts in his time. Back then, people used to just lay on couches and you wouldn't even face the person in front of you and be leveled with them. And Tennov, she wouldn't call these people she was interviewing subjects. She was calling them informants. There's these subtle ways that we can talk about this experience that takes us closer to the human condition. And then there's other ways that makes us pathologize something that is so normal, so natural, and so beautiful. I want to start off by directly answering the question, what is the difference between limerence and romantic love? I think when I'm putting all of this stuff together, I'm realizing that there is no distinct difference between limerence and romantic love, at least in the beginning. I think that they enter two very different stages, and romantic love can become platonic love. It can start to become real love. And when I say real love, I mean a love that's not so fiery and passionate. It doesn't happen involuntarily, and it doesn't happen just through your feelings. It is an action that you take to see the person for who they are and still choose to be in relationship with them. That is built on mutuality, reciprocation, and limerence is suspended in a state of fantasy where one has more control, at least insofar as they're able to project an idealized fantasy of a person. In true love, you see the person for who they are without hiding behind the idea of them. I think when you've only ever experienced limerent love, or when you try to compare limerent love to true love, it's really difficult to see why be settling for true love, which feels sometimes more mundane, but at the same time more leveled and secure. Limerent love throughout the stages starts to unravel into their longing. And like I said before, I think this is a very unconscious process. A lot of people confuse romantic love and obsession with true love. Think about The Notebook or Walk to Remember, or even Everything Everywhere All at Once. These movies blurred the lines between fantasy and created all these obstacles to get to this grand love story. Real love is doing taxes and laundry with somebody, and it might be more boring to the regular person, and boring can be the most safety and equanimity. Limerence is not a sustainable state to be in. I know that there's a lot of pleasure in limerence, at least in the early stages, but down the road it starts to consume you and at times makes you really not present in your life. In light of limerence, I think that someone can come to realize their loneliness, but also their need for connection. All defense mechanisms, such as daydreaming and through this fantasy, can also show you the way that you attach to other people, that it actually shows you there's a deep sense of longing. And most importantly, I'm gathering from this research that limerence, romantic love, and true love, and all of that still share in common that there is no origin. You can't pinpoint when love began and who created it. And it is very inspiring and creative and transcendental, and it makes you want to be a better person. That's all I really want to close with. I'm so curious to hear what you guys think about the original research and about any thoughts you guys have on your experience with limerence. If you've experienced longing, or if there's something that you think might be important for someone else to hear, write it in the comment. I love to hear how you guys are able to relate to something that feels so isolating. Again, thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you next time. Have a great day.